All right, welcome to the Simpleton Podcast. I'm here today with Corey Huber. Corey is someone who worked as an engineer on the internet when it was first starting and now lives at the end of a long road and has to do podcasts by a house phone. He's also someone who searched out Simple House in our early days and offered help, which is extraordinary. And he also, with his wife, started a ministry that helps fund Vocations. How are you doing, Corey?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Good. Can you kind of tell us the name of the ministry and what it does?
Sure. The full name is the Mater Ecclesiae Fund for Vocations. Mater Ecclesiae being Latin for Mother of the Church, which is what we decided to dedicate the organization to was the Virgin Mother under her title, Mother of the Church. So the Fund for Vocations, which is the short name everybody uses, its purpose is to enable individuals with student loans to enter and continue in religious life. If you are going to take a vow to religious life, one of the vows is going to be for poverty, and being in debt is essentially the flip side of being rich. If you were rich, you'd need to sell your goods and become poor, but if you're in debt, you owe someone money, and in justice, that money needs to be paid. So the church does not permit individuals in debt to take vows of poverty. So if you are like most individuals who are discerning religious life, you probably popped out of a four-year institution about 2-3 years ago, or maybe just last spring, who knows. And if that's the case, there's a really good chance that you borrowed money to pay for that education, and there's a good chance that it's a significant amount of money. The average these days is $30,000 to $40,000. And in order to enter religious life, that money has to be paid back. Student loans were designed to be paid over a 20-year working life, not on the spot, 3 or 4 months after you graduate. So this is a real burden for individuals discerning religious life. So what we do is you apply to us for a grant. We decide if we have enough money to issue a grant to everybody. Recently, we have been issuing grants to everybody, but that's not always been the case. And if we give you a grant, then we execute agreement between the individual who got the grant, the community they're going to, and ourselves that says, even though the loan still exists, we are good for the monthly payments. And we ask the community to recognize that situation as the equivalent of not having the debt, because we're making a promise that if the individual continues in formation and eventually gets to final vows, we will keep paying that debt off until it's gone. And then the other interesting thing is if the individual discerns that they do not have a vocation and leaves the community, then we return the debt to them because it was always still in their name. We never took actual responsibility for it from a legal point of view. We took responsibility from a promise to pay, but we didn't take over the loan legally, so it's still in their name. If they discern out, they take over making the payments. They don't have to pay us back for the payments we made while they were in discernment. So this permits someone with a student loan to go ahead and do the real discernment of religious life, which is entering a community and working with the formators in the community to figure out if they have a vocation.
So, Corey, I've got two questions about this. One, do you ask the person who's entering to do fundraising to cover, before they enter?
We do not. So there is a model out there like that, and a lot of people will know about that, but that is not our model. Instead, we take on full responsibility for raising the funds necessary to make these loan payments.
And do you only support orders that you believe in, or are you supporting anyone who has a vocation to a recognized Catholic order?
Yes, essentially, Our interest is in being sure that the community in question is living religious life according to the mind of the church. Another way of saying that would be they're orthodox. So we go through some effort to establish that that is the case for any given community that we encounter. Once that's established, we're agnostic about the communities as long as they're orthodox. We don't specialize in a particular kind of community, and we don't say no because we don't like the community. As long as we've established that they're living life appropriately, it's fine.
And by living life appropriately, do you mean like under the jurisdiction of the bishop or satisfying all the rules of that?
Yeah, it's a lot of things. Certainly those are part of them. But there's also issues about is the community so new that there's no understanding that they will actually survive to establish themselves as a real community. So there's issues like governance and number of members and all that kind of stuff. So the mechanism we use is twofold. We have a couple of organizations that we trust who are doing essentially the same thing, qualifying communities to be members of their organizations. So one of those is the Institute on Religious Life, which was founded by Father John Hardin back in the 70s, I think. Anyways, they are a membership organization. Their members are religious communities, and when someone applies to be a member of the IRL, they do work to establish the same kind of things we're looking for in a community, viability, orthodoxy, all that kind of thing. So if they're an affiliate of the IRL, we'll trust the IRL and say, yes, they can participate in our grant program. The second organization is the CMSWR, Council of Major Superiors of Women Religious. All of their communities naturally are women's communities. The IRL has affiliates that are both men and women's communities, so that's convenient. So if they're a member of the CMSWR, they do the same sort of work of making sure that only Orthodox communities are in their membership. Then again, we will trust the CMSWR for that. But not every community is a joiner, so there are plenty of communities that are neither affiliates of the IRL or members of the CMSWR. So at that point, we send material to the community, essentially a survey asking a huge number of questions. They will send it back to us, and then that goes in front of a special board we maintain, which we call the Religious Institute Review Board. Which is made up of a priest, one religious member, and some lay people who we trust. And they will review the information that comes back to us, and yay or nay, this is a community we want to participate in our grant program. But once that is done, that wouldn't be revisited again unless we see something strange going on in the community, and then they'd have to go back through that process. But so once we see each community once, then we don't have to revisit that unless something weird pops up.
So, Corey, this is like a very practical ministry, and it's not a ministry that most people would think of. Like when they think, hey, I want to start a ministry, they think feed the poor or do some mission work, right?
Yeah.
How did you guys come to the realization that there was a great need for this? And how did it come about that you decided that you could kind of start this organization?
Well, this is one of the more interesting things. You know, if you ask someone in religious life why they are in religious life, about 50% of them will say, because someone suggested it to me and thought that I might make a good religious. And in our case, that is what happened. Someone asked us to solve this problem. I converted to Catholicism after I retired from America Online. And I retired with some wealth. And I didn't go through RCIA because I didn't have a fondness for RCIA. I wanted to avoid it. And so I went to my local pastor and said, you know, I want to enter the church. Can you give me personal instruction? At the time, I had no idea how busy priests were and had no idea what I was asking this guy to do. But he was kind and helped me out. But in the process, he got to know me and my situation, so he knew, for example, that I had a private foundation that was making gifts to Catholic charities of different varieties. So after I'd entered the church a couple of years later, I remember sitting on a bench outside the parish church, and this same guy walks up and says, I know this kid in California. He thinks he wants to enter the Norbertines, who are located in Southern California. But they have an age limit. It was probably, my guess is probably like 30 or maybe. And the gentleman in question had essentially been a professional student, had never really made significant money, had made no dent on his student loans. So he had $40,000 in student loans. And he was 6 months away from the age limit that the Norbertines had for entry. And so he had to clear $40,000 in 6 months. And obviously a fairly tall order, particularly for guys, never held down a job. So the priest in question asked me if I could fix that problem. And he asked me, well, I was sitting next to my wife, Catherine, and Catherine is an accountant and knows a little bit about the IRS. She knew that the answer was, no, we can't do that, because our private foundation cannot make grants to individuals. It can make grants to other 501c3s, but private foundations are notoriously abused, and so the IRS has set a bunch of rules, and one of them is a private foundation, which is different from a public charity like your organization, cannot give money to individuals. But we had an interest in the problem, and this wasn't the first time this problem had been brought to our attention. We knew a community here in Virginia, in Berryville, a Trappist community, in which someone had indicated that they were having difficulties because of this. And there was a visiting priest at the parish who also said he had encountered this kind of problem when he was entering seminary. So he said, no, we can't do that, but let us go back to our lawyers and see if there is a way to do it, because it was of interest to us. And it's the kind of problem that I like to solve with my private foundation. I was more interested, as you noted, feeding people is a popular charitable activity, housing them, all those sorts of things. But my particular interest was in infrastructural stuff that has to be paid for, has to exist for some entity to do its work, but is kind of under the covers, not very sexy. A good example of this is a septic system for a religious community. You got to have a septic system, and it's got to be a pretty impressive one because you got like 40 guys living in your mother house. But it's very hard to fundraise for septic systems.
Yeah.
So, but that was the kind of work I'd like to do. And this also is a pretty infrastructural related thing. This debt has to go away, but it's not quite as sexy as, maybe paying seminary's education or something. So it was of interest because we had seen the problem more than once, and because it was in the category of problems we like to solve. So we went to our lawyers and said, how do we do this? And they said, you can give money to individuals, but because you're a private foundation, you have to ask the IRS first, and you have to design a grant program that has to pass IRS muster. They said, okay, help us do that. And so they went and did what lawyers do, which is a LexisNexis search, to find other folks who had attempted the same sort of thing. And the closest thing they found was some Lutherans. It's not just Catholics who are having trouble maintaining clergymen. Some Lutherans had noticed a lack of ministers, and they wanted to provide cash incentives to stay in the ministry. And so they did the same sort of thing. But the IRS ruled against them after they'd been operating it for a while because there were no strings attached to the fund. So they could give a grant to a Lutheran minister who could then take that and use it as startup money for some other business and leave the ministry. And the key thing the IRS wants is if you have a grant program to produce some end result, They want to see that end result. So in our case, we wanted to get people into religious life and get them to final vows and building up communities. So the IRS, at the end of our grant program for any given individual, mostly wants to see a nun or a monk. So in order to make sure that we didn't fall subject to the same denial that the Lutherans did, we attached strings. And the simple way to do that was we don't pay off the debt in its entirety when we issue the grant. We only promise to make the monthly payments. So if the person does not persevere, we have not spent $40,000. We've only, who knows. In the case of the gentleman who want to go to the Norbertines, we let the abbot know what we were attempting, and on the strength of that, he let the kid in, and I think in 6 weeks he left.
Oh, yeah. Well, hey, when you go to the IRS and have to show them monks and nuns, how many do you have to show them?
Oh, you don't have to show them any one in particular. I was being somewhat facetious.
I know, but I mean, like, how many nuns and monks has your organization facilitated?
I had to actually ask my wife that question before we talked, because I've backed off from governance a little, and I don't know those numbers as well as I used to. But we started in 2004, was the first grant was issued in 2004. So it's now almost 20 years. We have issued about 300 grants over that period of time. There are about maybe 100 or so, or 150, I think is the number, who are still in formation, and about 50 of those have made final profession.
Wow. That is an extraordinarily... I wasn't expecting you to say a number that high.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting to hear a number that high. For the longest time was hovering around a couple hundred grants and 100 in formation, and things have popped recently. We recently hired an executive director who has done a yeoman's job of raising funds, and we have been able to issue grants to more of the applicants that come to us than had been previously the case. So really quite good news.
I've had a hang up on the way religious orders handle student loans before, and I don't know that I've mentioned this to you or not, but like this is now like 20 years ago. I was talking to an order that was fairly large. It was Pontifical Rite. And because I had a background in finance, they thought I would like to meet, the brother who manages their finances. So I did. And the guy was telling me what he manages, and it was in the tens of millions of dollars. And it was extraordinarily high, I thought, And I said, well, how many members do you have? And he said the number of members was it was like if they had 80 million under management, they literally had 80 members. It was exactly $1 million per member. And I knew this order had a policy of only allowing people to join who had $10,000 or less of student loans. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of like, well, why do you need all this money per member? Why isn't this more voluntary poverty? And the answer was because of healthcare. Yeah. And I thought, well, one, that's kind of easy to, fundraise for an elderly religious who needs healthcare, but also $1 million per person. I think you're good. I think you were good a while ago, Well,
what was the average age in this community?
It was older. But my other point, though, was the thing that kind of bothered me was like, if you get a new member of your religious order and they become a priest, or even if they just become a janitor, aren't they going to be at least worth, even if they're working as a janitor, aren't they going to be worth say $20,000, $30,000 a year to you? And you're not paying them? Why wouldn't you allow a $40,000 student loan to come into the order and do exactly what you're doing, just make minimum payments and let them leave with the debt? Or if they become a priest, I think this sounds horrible, but I think it's a way you have to think. If you're a bishop and you could purchase priests for $100,000 or $500,000, they were good priests, wouldn't you just say, well, line them up, I'm going to purchase everything on the shelf?
Yeah, and bishops actually do that. They don't, but when we started, we had a program for both religious life and diocesan priesthood, and we never got an applicant for the diocesan priesthood. because of that very reason. Bishop looks at a guy who in every other respect would make a good priest, but he has $50,000 in debt. The bishop is going to solve that problem. He's going to tell him to go ahead, go into seminary. We'll put your debts in deferral while you're in school because we can do that legally. When he comes out, part of your stipend will go to pay that bill, and we'll figure it out so you can live. You won't starve to death as a priest, but we'll figure out how to make that happen because you're right. If he's priest material, he's worth taking care of a $50,000 debt. Plus, the bishop has an entire diocese to raise money from. He can solve that problem. So it has changed a little bit now because debts are getting so high for education that some dioceses are balking a little bit about really high numbers. So they'll set maximum. But that maximum is pretty high in most places. That it's like $40,000. So,
well, like, why? I guess, like, if there's a wealthy religious order, this is not a knock. I'm not trying to say they're not living poverty, but like, just as a very successful religious order that's good at fundraising, like any of the popular ones that are respectable, would you just ask them to take care of the person's debt? Because it seems like they can.
The application, the person who wants a grant, the application they have to fill out contains a lot of financial information. Everything about their loans, how much savings they have, whether they have a job. If they don't have a job, why don't they have a job? That's the thing. When we say no, we're saying no for financial reasons, not for vocational reasons. We know that we cannot look at a person in any kind of way and say, you have a vocation or you don't have a vocation. That is the responsibility of the community. The community has people who know how to do that. So if someone in the community, if some community says this person may have a vocation, that's good enough for us. And so one of the requirements of filing an application with us is that you have a conditional letter of acceptance from the community saying, yeah, if this guy's debt can be solved, he can come enter, because they do the discernment work. So when we look at an application, we're strictly looking at what other resources does this individual have? Is there some other way that this debt could be paid without us issuing a grant because our funds are limited? And, if we encountered a community with a bankroll like you identified, that guy would probably not get a grant because our answer would be they can help.
Yeah, they should be able to pay for this. And I do think that that's wrong, though, that I feel like communities don't value what they're getting out of a new vocation properly if their number's like 10,000.
I think the trouble is in your particular example, don't know the name of the community or anything, but you identified a community that probably gets one vocation every 5 years. It's odd that they would, with that many assets, that much in the way of assets, they would say no to any vocation. But, some older communities like that, I'm not sure if they're actually interested in new vocations. And sometimes communities like that, the people in charge of them, either the conference they're a member of or somebody at the Vatican, actually shuts them down and says you can't take on any new members because you do not have enough men of an age that could support the formation of a young man. So I think the problem is you just identified one of those outlier communities that we'd never see anyway. What I would emphasize for you and your listeners, that in the main, the communities that we help by issuing grants to people who want to enter them, they are in fact dirt poor. They do not have that kind of money lying around. Either that or they have a huge number of people with a huge number of amount of expenses. So what comes to mind is one of the communities, we don't issue grants to the communities, so it's a little bit confusing to actually say, but a community that we have helped several members enter is the National Dominicans. They're a really big community. I've seen a picture of them, I would guess, looking at the picture in my mind, 100 to 150 members, and they staff schools all across the country. Their budget is undoubtedly astronomical, but they're running that budget as close to the poverty line as they can, given the fact that they have so many people to take care of, and they have so many schools to manage and all that kind of stuff. They're not wasting money in any sense. So I think you just bumped into an outlier.
Right.
Outlier that we'll never see.
I liked what you said about, I was not aware that the Vatican monitors things and can sometimes shut down people accepting new vocations. Clearly that needs done sometimes. I just didn't know there was a system for that.
Yeah, there was a community, I think it was Benedictines in Utah. Gorgeous, beautiful valley location. But they only had like 4 or 5 men, and they were all 60 and older, and at one point they were just told, don't even look for new guys.
Right.
You need to sell your property and move elsewhere. So, yeah, it happens. Somebody is looking out for communities, yeah.
I kind of want to change the subject on you. Is there anything else you want to say about this student loan problem?
No. I've pretty much covered everything.
So you moved out into the country, and you're talking to me on a landline phone, which I bet in the next few years become popular, have a resurgence. I know that you're hopeful as a Catholic for the future, but are you also kind of a doomer? What do you think about where we're at right now as a society? Are you worried about things?
Well, I'm not a prepper, but I do things that preppers might do. And I didn't move out to the country for those reasons. I moved away from the city because I didn't like the congestion, and I like, a wider space to operate in. But it wasn't for doom and gloom reasons. One of the things when I first moved out here, the topic of interest was how far is it to a traffic light? And it turns out it's a long ways to a traffic light.
Oh, wow.
But to answer your question, which was, is there hope for our country, I think?
Well, I kind of am asking you, one of the slang words used today is doomer. Are you kind of a doomer?
I haven't heard that term, so define doomer for me.
You have a more negative outlook for the future of this little civilization we have going than a positive one. And I don't mean that in a religious, eternal sense, but more just in a practical sense, Yeah,
I would say I would qualify as that because I have come to the conclusion that it's not going to be a bang, it's going to be a whimper, that this country is going to fall apart over a long period of time. And because I'm 67 this year, I will undoubtedly be 6 feet under before it happens. But I do think that the way things are going, it's getting harder and harder to recover from without a lot of unpleasantness for a lot of people. So yeah, you can call me a doomer.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to take our conversation totally that direction. but I have another. We're trying to be lighthearted about things on our podcast while at the same time just look them straight in the eye. So
okay.
My other question is, as someone who is involved in the early days of the internet, probably the first time I got in the internet was the late 90s, and I remember the internet being kind of a wonderland of you couldn't believe that these websites were out there. Oh, there's someone who collects Pez dispensers. Oh, wow. Or, oh, look at this, little fan club or things like this, right? Or you'd learn about things you just didn't even know existed, And now when I sign on to the internet, particularly the Google search engine, I can't find anything. Like the search engine optimization seems to be such that I can't get to the interesting stuff. I almost have to go to a YouTube or go somewhere else to find something that's not like. Do you feel like that something in the internet has fundamentally changed over the last 20, 30 years? Or like, what's your view on all of that?
The difficulty you're having with Google is due to aggregation. It's the aggregators you're getting in the way of the top listings. So you have to get past all those people who are trying to make money on collecting information and putting it up on the top. So finding, you can still find the guy with the Pez collection because that's relatively unique, and the aggregators have no interest in it. So if you type in Pez collection, that guy's going to come up pretty close to the top. But if you want to type in, if you're looking for a rental property, someplace to move into, it's going to be hard to find individuals who are offering units for rent. You're instead going to find all the people who want to be the middleman between you and getting to that individual with a property for rent. That's just a natural offshoot of capitalism and the internet. Yeah, it's annoying, and you have to live with it.
Well, I kind of felt like there was a wild west of the internet, and I think now I've heard people use this term called dead internet theory, and I don't know exactly what they mean by that, but I think they mean that like there was this wild west where it felt like a lot of interesting information was out there and you could go down all these rabbit holes. And now I can't remember, I don't think in years I've ever gone down a Google rabbit hole, where I just went from site to site to site discovering things.
Yes. The rabbit warren thing for me is Wikipedia. I'll start reading a Wikipedia article about something I can trust. It's mostly historical stuff. If they can manage recent history, they're not so good at. But history from like the 1920s and later, they're reliable. I'll go look something up, and in the middle of the article, it'll bring up some other idea that looks interesting. Click on that, click on that, click on that. I used to just queue up tabs, and it would take forever to get through them. Anyways, so there's still, if you want that rabbit warren experience, try Wikipedia. But, I never had a great interest in doing those things. One of the reasons I'm on a landline is I'm a bit of a Luddite. Yes, I was a programmer, and I worked for an internet company in the late 90s. So I saw all this stuff happening around me, but I have a fascination with programming, writing software, but no particular interest in what it can be used for. I'm more interested in the details of the program and whether it's well done and if the structures are as smooth as they could be. I just don't have much interest in what's going on in the internet. So you keep identifying nomenclature, doomer, and this other thing, and I've never heard of those things. I spend almost no time online. Even though I was at the beginning. And the other problem was I didn't work for the cool stuff. I didn't work in the sexy departments. I worked in the billing department.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
But it was still very advanced work because at one point AOL had like 30 million customers, and there are 30 days in a month. So every day they were billing 1 million people. Every day they took whatever it was, $10.99 off of somebody's credit card 1 million times. So the stuff I worked in was interesting because there was so much work to do that had to be crammed into one 24-hour period. And if you missed a day billing 1 million people, that's a real hit to the bottom line of the company. So this was really highly critical software, had to run right every day, and if anything went wrong, it was 3 months to fix it kind of stuff. So I don't actually know that much about the internet.
Oh, that's good. Well, let me ask you this, though. I know you've thought a lot about, maybe this could be a final question unless you got another place you want to go with it. I know you've thought a lot about college debt, the rising cost of higher education, Do you have any thoughts for parents or young people getting ready to choose a school for higher education and how to think about the financial part of that or even the quality of the education?
Yeah, I do have some thoughts, but I think I should preface them with my biases, which are not insignificant. The first bias is I got a 4-year degree from the University of Washington, Seattle, but I spent first 2 years in a community college on the other side of the Sound in a little place called Bremerton. And that really colored how I view 4-year degrees. I didn't have that 4-year college experience. I had 2 years in my hometown, essentially going to a high school where they let you smoke. That was the only difference between community college and high school. And then I transferred those credits into a bigger university, but I didn't really, by that time, I'd gotten enough maturity not to be impressed one way or other by what was going on campus. So there's that. And I think that is the ultimate way to go, because the community college my parents paid for, it was cheap enough they could pay for it. And my university courses, this is 40 years ago, so college was a lot cheaper. I just went to work and paid for my college courses in the last year. And the year prior to that, I managed to get a scholarship that paid for all of them. And I had an opportunity to live fairly cheaply in a house of Christian men. So I got a higher education for not very much money by breaking it up between community college and the university. And of course, the University of Washington is a state school, so it was well underwritten. So there's that. The other bias I have, and it's not so much a bias, it's an experience of seeing so many people with so much debt who got so little for it. So one of the pieces of the application everyone has to do is to write a vocation essay. Essentially, tell us why you think you have a vocation to religious life. How did you get it? How did you discern it? All that kind of stuff. And clearly half of those are not very well written. So English is a basic, everybody has to take English to get a degree, and somebody is not teaching these people how to form sentences and paragraphs and to carry a thought through. It only has to be a couple pages long, this essay, and it's just very underwhelming. So that is, with that experience behind me, how I got an education, and seeing the results of other people's educations who are looking to me to assist them, I'd say college is completely overrated. And paying big bucks for a 4-year university education could very easily be a colossal waste of money. But there is a problem, and it has been pointed out to me by a man with 8 or 9 children, and he is going to pay for every one of them to go through school, even though this same man knows my apostolate exceedingly well because he's the copywriter for our fundraising letters. So he understands the problem 100%, and he still is going to pay for that education for every one of his children. He has identified the reason he must do that, and that is what is wrong with the whole system. Employers are looking for a degree. You want to get a good job, you need to hand them a diploma. If employers in this country would wake up, smell the roses, and realize that diploma says absolutely nothing in a large percentage of the cases. One of the things employers are doing is taking the easy route. There you go. You got to have a degree, a BS, in order to apply. That easily weeds out a huge number of people for them. Sets a baseline. It makes it easy for them to run their employment portions of their businesses. But it's a real cop-out because there are plenty of people who could fill their positions without that degree and do at least and possibly better job than the people who got the degree. But as long as that is the case, and this man realizes, his father of several children realizes that as long as employers are requiring a college diploma, then he needs to get that college diploma for all his children so that they can succeed in life. And that's what he wants for them. He loves them. He wants them to succeed in life. So that's the basic problem with the system. Independent of the whole problem of tuitions that are astronomically too high because there's a third-party payer in the business, and that's the federal government issuing loans. If you had to pay for the college education up front, then tuition fees would be a whole lot less because there isn't some big daddy in the corner just shelling out the money. And the colleges would have to deal with that and run their budgets accordingly.
I have this other issue, though, that like as a father, I'm very comfortable that my kids can make quite a bit of money without ever going to college, either as self-employed or tradesmen or something like that, you know. My problem is that like whenever you go and talk to someone who went to college and you say, what was your favorite part of college? They never mention the classes. You know, they always mention like some club or activity or living situation, you know, or party. And it's almost to me like the great thing about college is that ecosystem that comes with it, that grows up around it, like the clubs.
A lot of people think that that's why they're paying the big bucks, is because they're getting the college experience for their children. And I think that is just fuzzy thinking.
You do. You don't think that you don't see that as like I feel like guys who go into the military out of high school also, it's not just the money or any job training in the military. It's like they have this like formative experience, you know?
And I would agree, but the military is a completely different operation than a university. You know, the military expects you to be a responsible individual, and don't think that there's anything about the college experience that really requires you to be a responsible individual.
So it's kind of a bad formation. It is an experience.
Just enough to get a passing grade, and they will hand you that diploma. And, you know, some employers might ask what your college GPA was, but it's the diploma that counts more than anything else. And there's a total lack of responsibility on campuses, I think. So I think there are perceptions about college education that were true at one time, maybe 40 years ago. They have slowly becoming untrue on a very broad perspective. More and more campuses, these perspectives are no longer hold water, to the point where it's sort of been baked into the American psyche that you got to go to the university to get that experience. Well, I think the problem is that experience is no longer available at the university. So I've often thought that university graduates would have a wonderful class action suit available to them. They paid large sums of money for something they did not get, either education or the experience.
Yeah, I've also seen a proposal that in any type of student loan forgiveness program, you should make the university itself pay for half of it.
They should pay for all of it, quite.
Yeah.
In our household, the issue of paying back debts is a matter of justice. I mean, the program we run might just go out of existence if certain communists had their way in this country. And that would be fine. We'd shut it down, and we'd be happy for what we had done, and we wouldn't feel bad about it. But we've encountered parents who ask us, aren't we going to take advantage of these loan forgiveness programs? And we think the loans should be paid back because a student signed a promissory note promising to pay back that loan. It's a matter of justice. It needs to be paid back, not forgiven. if it's forgiven, it's neither the banks nor the colleges that will suffer as a result. It's all the taxpayers in this country. So case in point, the payments have been deferred for the longest time here. We've been making the payments right along. So we have been taking advantage, which means by us making the payments, even though they're currently deferred, we get ahead on the loans, and interest is not accruing. So that's good for us. But we would never think that we should suddenly stop paying these debts just because there's a government handout to be had. That's completely unjust.
Great. Well, Corey, thank you.
Well, thank you. It's been nice chatting with you, Clark.
Right. I love that 150 or so religious are now, that you facilitated that. That's great.
That's an amazing thing. It is mind-boggling. So I put a shout-out to the new executive director, Mary Radford, who has been working for us for 3 years and doing a terrific job of raising money, so that lately we've been issuing grants to all the applicants that present, and hopefully that will continue, because in the past we were turning them away. At one point in our very early days, we were turning away about 75% of the applicants.
Oh, wow.
Then it got to be about 50% of what we were turning away. And again, strictly for financial reasons. But now, everybody's getting a grant.
That's great. All right. Well, thank you, Corey. Thank you for listening to the Simpleton Podcast. Like, subscribe, and comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Clark.